Lose the momentum here. We're going to switch to some data talk. We've had some really good talks this morning, but want to keep the momentum going. So just realize every number that I say is a person. Not trying to gloss over that, so just wanted to start this presentation out with that. So the purpose of this overview is to provide you all with an overall context of gun violence by the numbers, both here in Wisconsin and nationally. The next is to develop a shared understanding of the measurement and frequency of gun violence over the last decade. So I know we're halfway into a conference here, but I just want to define what gun violence is. Gun-related violence is any violence that was committed with use of a firearm. I'm sure most folks are aware of that. I just wanted to state that definition. There's also different types of gun violence. So oftentimes I think we think of homicides when we talk about gun violence, but there's also suicides as well that occur with a firearm. We also have non-fatal shooting injuries, so people who don't, incidents that don't result in death. We also have unintentional firearm injuries where they were not intending to harm someone. So there's also incidents where there's not an injury that occurs, so that could be just brandishing a firearm to someone, and just something that does not result in an injury. Next is just there's different types of gun violence. It doesn't occur at the interpersonal level, so there's community level violence, there's violence between domestic partners, mass shootings, school violence, just different forms of that at different levels as well. So wanted to highlight that too. And then so the next thing is how do we measure gun violence? So public health professionals often describe gun violence by injuries. So someone was shot with a firearm, so they end up in a hospital, or unfortunately, sometimes at the coroner or medical examiner office, so that's typically how we count our gun-related violence for law enforcement. That's often counted by crime, so just gun-related crime that occurs. So why are we talking about gun violence? I'm sure you guys are all very aware of these things, but it does impact individuals, families, communities across the state and the country. Gun violence is the leading cause of premature death in the U.S. Gun violence has become a leading cause of death for the children 0 to 19, and gun violence should be something we all are collectively working on. So all the data I'm just going to share in this presentation, it all comes from publicly available data sources. So the national data, mortality data, comes from CDC's Wonder. It's an online query tool. You can go there if folks want to talk to me about that after the presentation. Everything in this comes from an online, publicly available data source. The injury data comes from Whiskers. It's very similar to Wonder, but focuses more on non-fatal injuries. The crime data comes from the FBI's UCR database. They also have an online query tool for looking at that data. And then the Wisconsin-specific data comes from their WISH tool. So I'm going to be talking a lot about rates today, but I think oftentimes counts are a little more memorable, and it's a little more difficult to interpret rates. So I think the first place to start is with some counts here. So nationally, we had over 44,000 deaths due to firearms in 2020. That comes out to 124 deaths per day, and over half of the firearm deaths are by suicide, and then slightly under half of our deaths nationally are homicides, firearm deaths. And then looking at just firearm-related crimes, we had almost 180,000 firearm-related crimes nationally in 2020. And I just want to mention the reason we're using 2020 data. I know this might seem a little outdated, but this is the most currently available data we have at the national level. So just wanted to highlight that as well. Looking at Wisconsin specifically, 2020 we had 712 deaths due to firearms. That's almost 2 deaths every day from a firearm, and close to 1,300 firearm-related hospitalizations in 2020, and almost 5,000 crimes with a firearm. So now I'm going to move into some trend lines here, just to see how these numbers are moving over the years. This data goes back to 2010. That top orange line is all firearm deaths. That's going to be combining homicides as well as suicides, unintentional firearm deaths, and undetermined intent. So you can see here that the rate has increased from 2010 to 2020. So right now we're at a 13.5, a rate of 13.5 per 100,000. Across all firearm deaths. Below that line is the firearm suicide rate. So you can see that's the next highest line. So most of the firearm deaths are in fact suicides with firearm, and then followed by firearm homicides. I do want to point out that difference from 2019 to 2020. we do see a pretty substantial increase there. I think in 2019 we had a rate about 4.4, and then it went to 5.9 in 2020. COVID definitely had some impact on firearm-related injuries and deaths. For unintentional firearm and firearm of undetermined intent, those are pretty flat across the year, so not a whole lot of movement in those. Moving on, so kind of that's the tip of the iceberg, looking at deaths. The next kind of piece of data here is just the injuries. So this is looking at injuries nationally. We've gone from a rate of 25 per 100,000 to 47 per 100,000, so almost a doubling of firearm injuries nationally from 2010 to 2020. And then another piece of this is just the entirety of the crime that we see that's firearm related. So that has seen quite a substantial increase nationally. That has gone from a rate of 24 per 100,000 in 2015, this data goes back to, and then in 2021 we saw that up at 71, so almost a tripling there for our firearm-involved crime. Another thing I wanted to highlight here is looking at it across different size cities, municipalities. So often the conversations around firearm issues in cities, and I just wanted to show this data to highlight that it does occur as well in our rural areas. The rural firearm deaths are more often due to suicide. Our city ones are often more due to homicide, but you can see here that nationally we actually have a higher rate of firearm deaths in our micropolitan areas compared to our metropolitan areas. Here's just looking at Wisconsin-specific data now, so you can see the line's a little more jagged, but you can see an increase in all firearm deaths from 2010 to 2020. That's gone from 8.8 to 12.2. Again, you can see that was driven in 2019 to 2020. A lot of that increase was driven by our firearm homicides. If you go back a little ways, there's a bit of an uptick in 2012, 2013 there. Driving the increase in firearm rates. So just wanted to point those two pieces out there. Unintentional firearm has remained relatively flat over those years. Now again, looking at the Wisconsin-specific injuries, pretty flat. This goes back to 2016 to 2021. Pretty flat from 2016 to 2019. We see a pretty substantial increase from 2019 to 2020. Again, similar to what we're seeing with the homicide data, and then it does seem to flatten off a bit from 2020 to 2021. But yeah, had a rate of 22.4 per 100,000 firearm injuries in Wisconsin. Next is the UCR data. So we don't see quite the exponential increase we're seeing at the national level, but there has been an increase as well in Wisconsin. So you can see here it increased 2015 to 2021 from up to 91 in 2021 for our firearm-involved violent crimes. This is the same graph looking now at those different designations of urban versus rural. We can see that those numbers do kind of jump around when we look at just Wisconsin data, but again, just showing that firearm deaths are an issue both in our urban and rural areas. So I described a lot about the trends over the years, kind of how the numbers are moving, and now I want to describe a bit about who it's happening to. So this data is just from 2020. You can see here that far and away males are much higher victims of firearm deaths. Here, males had a 23.7 rate per 100,000 at the national level, and compared to women who had a 3.7 per 100,000 rates. Wisconsin is a little bit less than that, so but not too far off from what we're seeing at the national level. Looking at our different age breakdowns, the highest rates of firearm deaths amongst ages is those 15 to 34 years of age, and that's pretty similar for nationally as well as in Wisconsin. And then with respect to demographics, we see those reported as Black having the highest rates of firearm deaths, and then those reported as non-Hispanic as well. So I wanted to provide a little bit of data around who the firearm deaths are happening to, and then just some key takeaways from this presentation. I know it's a lot of data. I know we all just ate lunch, and so I'm sure we're a little sluggish, but just some key takeaways from this presentation. That the gun-related violence is increasing with respect to injuries, deaths, as well as crime, nationally as well as in Wisconsin. Suicides and homicides are the majority of what we see for firearm deaths. And this is an issue in our urban areas as well as rural areas. So that that focus needs to be widespread. And then, yeah, again, young men have the highest rates of firearm deaths, but that's just looking at deaths. And I just want to mention, too, that the impact of firearm-related violence impacts way more people than just this group of people who are dying. So just wanted to mention that as well. So those are my key takeaways, and I have questions if they want to do those, or if we're waiting till the end. Yeah, okay. Awesome. Thank you.